But how does a lesbian speak? I would prefer to do a gay man. These are frequent responses when I asked my friends to imitate lesbian speaking patterns.
Knowledge of stereotypes regarding lesbian speech seems to be weak. This asymmetry is reflected in the fact that studies referring to phonetic correlates of sexual orientation have largely concentrated on differences between gay and straight men. By comparison, relatively few studies have compared acoustic features of the speech of self-identified lesbian and straight women. In addition, the findings of previous research are inconsistent. We will return to this point later in the literature review section. Thirdly, a wealth of existing study was based on Western countries. There are a few studies directly covered in standard Chinese Mandarin speakers. These observations motivate me to investigate the speech pattern of Chinese lesbian and bisexual women. Since this study aims to uncover the phonetic variables that compose a common stereotype of lesbian speech, phonetic knowledge and approaches will provide a foundation to shed light on how people use their speech to index their social group membership. It is insightful to combine the phonetic approach to probe the sociolinguistic problems. Here, my research questions are as follows. First, what are the acoustic correlates of sexual orientation in standard Chinese Mandarin-speaking women? Second, is there a significant difference in vowel production between lesbian and bisexual and heterosexual women speakers? Now, let's turn to the literature review section. To begin my discussion, one fundamental theory must be introduced here: self-driven gender inversion theory. This theory assumes that the sexual minority population tends to mirror the opposite sex speech pattern. That means gay men tend to speak like a heterosexual woman. Various lesbian and bisexual female speakers are expected to mirror the speech pattern of the straight man. Therefore, we'd better have a quick review about phonetic difference between male and female speech. When we are hearing an utterance, it is pretty easy for us to identify whether male and female the speaker is, without any other visual cues. This can be related to the difference in average pitch, pitch range and variability, voice quality, vowel dispersion, and other articulatory and acoustic parameters between male and female speakers. These acoustic characteristics are influenced both by biological inevitabilities and also learned behaviors. For example, in phonetics, the fundamental frequency is tightly related to the perceived average pitch of the speaker. Due to biological structure, male vocal folds tend to be longer and thicker than female vocal folds, causing them to vibrate more slowly. Male speakers have the lower fundamental frequency and the lower pitch voice than females. But many studies already suggest that the fundamental frequency is not purely biological. It can also be influenced by the learned behavior. This can be supported by the evidence from the speech pattern of pre-adolescent boys and girls. If the acoustic characteristics can be learned naturally, it is possible to assume that people could change their speech patterns to index their certain identities. Therefore, according to the gender inversion theory, we have expected lesbian and bisexual women's speech pattern to turn to straight men's speech patterns, like lower fundamental frequency, lower average pitch, smaller pitch range, producing vowel space closer from straight man vowel space than their heterosexual counterparts. But in the previous study, the findings are inconsistent. The table I listed here shows the previous finding on patterns of speech production and perception based on sexual orientation in women. From the table, we can see some acoustic markers of sexual orientation in women have been identified, but have not been consistently replicated. After reviewing the previous study, I think the inconsistencies may come from data collection, small sample size, and a coarse grouping of lesbian and bisexual women. To remedy the weakness of the previous study and fill the research gap, I designed an experiment to solve my research questions. To answer the research question, a large-scale quantitatively comparative study will be conducted between 50 to 70 self-identified lesbian and bisexual participants and an equal amount of heterosexual women. To control confounding variables, educational level, age, and ethnicity will be carefully controlled. All participants are expected to be students between 20 to 30 years old and a native speaker of Standard Chinese Mandarin. In the process of collecting data, reading speech and spontaneous speech data will both be collected to represent different communicative events. For the reading task, participants will be asked to read a list of sentences, which designed to elicit 7 common vowels in Chinese. In the spontaneous speech task, I adopted a no-participant observation method, self-recording, to elicit speech and collect more natural occurring data. It is not widely used in social phonetic research, but some studies proved that it provides an appealing method in data collection because it improves the ecological validity in speech events. In my research design, participants are required to self-record 3 different communicative activities in their daily life and send the sound file back for analysis. After collecting data, the following acoustic parameters will be measured for both reading speech and spontaneous speech. I choose to use median fundamental frequency instead of the mean fundamental frequency to better account for the outlier. It will be measured with Pratt pitch tracking algorithm. Second, single formant frequency will be measured in the middle of each vowel using the LPC formant tracking function in Pratt. To calculate mean F1 and F2 for all vowels, single values for each vowel are divided by the number of vowels to indicate the vowel space shift. Based on the previous study and research design, I can positively predict that there exists some cluster of phonetic variables that are expected of lesbian speech, or that make a woman sound like a lesbian when she uses them. For example, LB speakers might show the expanded vowel space than heterosexual women. LB speakers might produce mean F1 and F2 values that are lower than heterosexual women, which to some degree is in line with gender inversion theory. However, since the findings of the previous study are inconsistent, thus it is hard to predict that whether the differences are significant between two groups and which vowel produced contributes most to the difference between lesbian or bisexual women and heterosexual women. It is also reasonable to predict not all phonetic variables are associated with lesbian speech patterns. In other words, the results of the study might be mixed. If the results are not accompanied with my hypothesized results, such as there are no acoustic correlates of sexual orientation in women, I will reflect the limitation of the current study design in methodology, data collection, and participants. Besides, more psychological factors also need to be considered in the future. For example, except for the comparison between the different linguistic groups, we can also compare within the group. How are the social philosophy factors like social contact, self-identity, and affiliation influence sexual minority population speech pattern? Overall, I do hope current research could be conducted in the future and shed more light on the topic that phonetic correlates of sexual orientation in the cross-linguistic perspective. Thanks for your listening.